So the question I'm asking this week is, do you care about the Windrush generation? Now, don't answer that yet. Don't answer right now. It's a question that I would like you to think about, okay? And for those of you who are listening to this and saying, well, who are the Windrush? What's the Windrush generation? I have left some information in the description box below for you to do a little bit of research on who I'm talking about. And for those of you who have been following my channel, then you will know that the Windrush generation is pretty much the British subjects who were born and raised in the Caribbean before most of the Caribbean became their own independent countries. And they were all colonized by the United Kingdom, by Great Britain, right? So they were British subjects living in their respective Caribbean countries, and in my case, or my roots, that pretty much describes my parents, okay? That would be in Jamaica. And these people were in the mid-1940s, around about the time that World War II was taking place. They were initially invited to come and join the war effort on behalf of Great Britain. And as the war escalated and it was a victory for England, these British subjects returned to their respective Caribbean islands. But then after that, another invitation was extended, generally to all British subjects, and they were now invited to come to Britain to help rebuild that war-torn country. So my parents were in their early 20s then, and my mum says to me that she remembers that Winston Churchill came to a place in Jamaica, a place in Westmoreland, and specifically Savannah Lamar, or Sav Lamar. And she said that she remembers seeing Winston Churchill and him holding up his V for Victory sign. And he was there, she said, to specifically invite and recruit British subjects from Jamaica to go and live and work in England and to help build up the country. I've done some research on that. Yes, Winston Churchill did come to Jamaica, and yes, he was the one that came. It wasn't, someone on his behalf. He came, and as did other politicians from the UK. But the key thing here is that a general invitation was extended to all British subjects who lived in the Caribbean to go to England to live and to work and to help build up that war-torn country, right? They became what is defined as the Windrush generation. Young people in their mid-20s, some of them married, some of them not, men and women, some of them skilled, some of them unskilled, some of them educated, some of them uneducated. But these were pretty much the backbone of who made up the Windrush generation. And there was a call, a cry for these people from England, because what England needed at that point in time in history was manual labor. This was in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, a time before this computerized age where people went out and physically worked to build communities, to build societies. So you needed physical hands-on labor. They were the Windrush generation, and they took up the call from the different Caribbean islands as young people, and they went to England and built up British society at that time. the Windrush Generation. So fast forward now, and we're in 2018, and the Windrush Generation seems to be the hot topic now in terms of British politics. But why? Because the government is reshaping its policy around immigration, okay, especially in terms of the influx of other Europeans into England, the whole aftermath of Brexit, and just the world, in the way that the world is going in general. And it seems to me, right, that the policies that have been put out by the British government, well, they say that they're there to clamp down on what they define as illegal immigration. And in doing that, there seems to have been a misstep, a misjudgment, a disregard for the immigration laws that allowed the Windrush Generation to be in England. Now, they came in under the context that they were invited to England to live, to work. They're British in the entire sense of the word. Because the immigration laws are now being rewritten, redefined to keep out illegal immigrants, somehow in that mix, somehow within those policies, the Windrush Generation seems to be caught up and is now collateral damage within that change. A number of them have been deported, and a number of them have been asked to produce documentation from 30, 40, 50 years ago that it's unreasonable to think that they even have. And on top of that, there's a lot of controversy in regards to even the documentation that the British government has kept for these British subjects along the way, and a definite acknowledgement that, hey, at some point the British government destroyed a lot of the documentation that they had for those subjects at that point in time. The Home Office, which is one of the government entities that handles immigration, is currently under a lot of scrutiny now because of the policies that they have shaped and they have carried out, which have impacted negatively upon the Windrush Generation. And that's why I'm asking that question. Do you care about the Windrush Generation? So like I said, before you even start to think about answering that question, I want to give you a perspective of the Windrush Generation from my point of view. And keep in mind that my perspective probably is not objective, because the Windrush, as I mentioned, are my parents, right? I'm British born, first generation Black British. My parents. But let me just say a few things, right? Just from my own perspective and just from talking to the Windrush Generation in my family, right? So my mum and dad came in their mid-20s. They were married already. They were married to each other already in Jamaica. They left behind 3 children they were being taken care of by my great-grandmother, right? And my parents came in the early 60s. My dad came to England first, which was a common thing. Most of the initial Windrush generation that came to England were the men. Some of them were married, some of them were single, but a lot of young men came. And then within a space of about 2 or 3 years, my mum came, right? Okay, so my dad, right, in Jamaica, my dad in his late teens and early 20s, he used to operate the only cinema in his small town. He didn't own it, but he operated it. So that was his job there. So he would get all the reels, and back then when you had a cinema, because remember this was the 1950s, 60s, so all films and movies came on those big reels. So my dad was trained to operate the equipment, he was trained to set up the films, and my mum has told me that when they first started dating, that she used to get to see all the like American films, the British films that used to come in, and she used to get to see them firsthand, because what my dad had to do was to set up the reel and had to play it through a couple of times before it was actually shown to the general public, right? So I thought it was fascinating that he was that he used to handle that kind of equipment. So that was the skill that he initially had. And then after that, he then was hired to be a manager at a general store. It was an Asian-owned store. He had a very good relationship with the owners, because my mum says to me that they actually named me after one of the co-owners, which I thought was very interesting. But anyway, they liked my dad very much, and that was his key job at that point in time. So actually, my dad, my mum told me, didn't really want to come to England. My dad wasn't really interested. He already had his skills. He was happy living in Jamaica. I think my mum was a lot more ambitious than him, and she had a desire to just travel generally, right? So when that request came, she was, she wanted to leave Jamaica immediately. But back in those days, it was not common and it was not desirable for a woman to just leave, especially as a married woman, and make that kind of transition. So she had to wait until my dad came to England and he got settled, and then within a short period of time he sent for her. So let me go back to my mum in her youth, right, prior to coming to England, right? So my mum, she had about a 6th grade education, and it was very common for women not to be pushed into higher education. Now, the common thing for women back in those days, if they had any level of education, that they would become teachers, they would go into nursing, they would go into any kind of career that you would normally associate, even now, women with. Funnily enough, my great-grandfather, his logic back in those days, and he always emphasized that to my mum and my aunt, that a woman should not need anything more back then than to be able to count to 100, than to take care of the household, meaning cooking and cleaning, and finding a husband and taking care of the husband. So that was as much as that generation and prior to them that they strive for when it came to women. But my mum was a little bit different. She was a lot more ambitious than that. So even though she had a limited education, when she was in Jamaica as a young woman, she actually created a business for herself where she would be the middle person between someone who wanted to leave Jamaica and go to England. And what I mean by that is that she would be the person who would get all the documentation necessary for a person to travel. So she would find out who would be looking to go to England, and then, you know, go and see that person, or they would come to her, and then she would have to go to the necessary, you know, agency or local government and, you know, get the necessary documents, and she'll get paid for that, you know. And that was her primary source of income up until the time that she left Jamaica.